Okay, so today we're going to talk about Lyme disease testing and why it's so controversial. Now, Lyme disease testing is typically done as what we would call a Western blot, or we do some antibody testing. And the issue with this test is actually that the timing is really, really important. So if you get the test, a week or two after the bite, it could be not accurate, meaning it just wouldn't be positive enough for it to show up on the test. Now, the other side of that is as you go further away from the bite, past kind of the 3, 4 month mark, the accuracy can go down to as low as 60%. And some people will even argue that it goes down to even 30%. So that would mean 4 in 10 people's diagnosis being missed, all the way up to 7 out of 10 people being missed in terms of a chronic disease or a chronic Lyme disease diagnosis. Now, the other controversy behind Lyme disease diagnoses is the whether or not the test is still valid. And the reason we say that is because we know now that the test was based on one to potentially three different strains that were isolated in Lyme County in the United States many decades ago. And since then, we've identified over 20 strains of Lyme disease. And we know now that these foreign Lyme disease strains that we thought were a European strain or an Australian strain, they are actually or have been isolated in the United States and Canada. Now, why is that? Well, one thing is obviously human beings travel, and we traveled a lot more than we used to. So these trips down to the Caribbean or these trips to Australia or Southeast Asia or places like that, we can get bit by ticks, get these bacteria transmitted to us that won't trigger kind of a traditional US or North American Lyme disease positive on a test. The other thing is because of whether environmental changes, etc. We have migratory bird patterns are changing. So we know now that certain birds are going more north than they ever did before. And birds are the primary vector. Like deer get a lot of bad press, but there's only a certain range of deer. In fact, most of the ticks that contain Lyme disease harbor in rabbits and mice over the winter, hanging out either under the snow or hiding out from all the predators. And then in the springtime, deer could get infected, and the Lyme or the ticks containing Lyme will fall off, engorged with blood, lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch, and then those little wee tiny little nymphs will attach to mice and rabbits and deer and potentially moose and stuff and harbor over the winter again. But they also attach to birds. And the amazing thing about birds is they have an amazing range, to use that word twice. They can fly thousands of miles. So what we're seeing is we're seeing European strains found in Canada. We're seeing Asian strains found in the United States. And so that test needs to be updated. Now, is it to say that it's a terrible test? It's not a terrible test, but we know that most lab testing can be improved upon. And so one of the important things is we need to utilize potentially some other countries' lab facilities. So in the United States, there is some alternative labs. And when I say alternative, I just mean it by another choice. It doesn't mean that they are fringy or they're not using science. There is obviously some controversy as to the sensitivity and specificity, meaning the accuracy of all of those tests. But one would argue that no matter what lab you go to, there is going to be some weakness in whatever tests they do use for Lyme disease. So typically, I'll recommend using a lab that tests in as many ways as possible. Now, if we're just doing a simple kind of DNA test, like a Western blot test or an antibody test, and it's not testing for the right strains, then there's a good chance we're going to miss it. The other thing is there's two sides to the immune system. So there's something what they call, and I'll use a little bit of jargon now, but Th1 and Th2. So basically, you have Th1 is your uh, immune system that's, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily dumb, but it doesn't have traditionally thought of as a long-term memory. It's kind of like your frontline soldiers that have a look and say, oh, look, there's an enemy, and it shoots it. And so whenever it sees anything kind of foreign in the body, it'll attack it. And that's usually what happens the initial stages of almost every infection is you have this Th1 response. And then if that infection persists and goes on for a long period of time, then the Th2 will come on board. So these are the smart long-term memory immune soldiers. And it'll typically transition from this kind of simple shoot first kind of soldier to a long-term memory soldier. So typically antibodies will be produced and this side of the immune system will take over. But the one thing we learned during COVID, and we knew this before, but I think it was so much more apparent, was that there is genetic individuality in terms of how people's immune systems attack certain infections. And so for some people, you would see this upregulation of their Th1, and in some patients, you would see the Th2 response. And so with COVID, we saw some people weren't producing antibodies to the COVID-19 virus. That didn't mean that necessarily they didn't have long-term immunity to it or that their immune system wasn't equipped to handle it. It just may have meant that their original kind of infantry shoot first soldiers were actually really good at the job, that it didn't linger around long enough for the body to say, hey, I have to remember that and I have to make sure that I produce antibodies to that. And the same thing happens with Lyme disease. Is quite often we'll see this kind of imbalance within the population. So some people, their Th1 is upregulated, some people, their Th2 is upregulated. And what does that mean when it comes to testing? What it essentially means is that we have to test both sides of the immune system. So that's what's really important when we're looking at alternative labs or alternative choices for labs. Now, personally, I choose to use a lab in Germany, and I can provide some links and some options if you want to learn more about that. There is a lab in the United States that is very good as well. You can make your choices for whatever reasons you choose. I definitely have mine, but nonetheless, there is more of a chance of having catching a chronic Lyme disease patient with using a lab that tests for different sides of the immune system. Both sides of the immune system is what I'm saying. The other thing you want to do if you're going to test for chronic Lyme or even acute Lyme is you want to look for co-infections. So when I have actually taken the tick, and that's one of the best things you can do, and one of the cheapest ways that you can assess whether or not you had a transmission of the disease, or at least the potential of transmission, is to keep the tick, putting it in a plastic bag and sending it into these labs that test the tick, because a tick can carry more than one disease. And so you can have Lyme disease, you can have ehrlichiosis, anaplasma, Bartonella, Babesia, you could have rickettsia. There is all kinds of Rocky Mountain spotted fever is rickettsia if you haven't heard of it before. There's a lot of different organisms that can be passed through the bacteria. And you know what? That may be why some people don't end up getting the Lyme diagnosis, is because they're actually sick from some of the co-infections that produce symptoms that are very similar to Lyme disease, but it isn't Lyme disease. And so that's why when you get tested in the regular medical system, quite often a lot of these people are missed, or the diagnosis is missed, because it isn't Lyme disease. It's actually one of the other bacteria that is transmitted. And we'll talk more about those kind of Lyme disease and co-infections in a further talk that I'll record here. But so it's really, really important that you get the proper testing, that you cast a very broad net when you get that testing done, and the testing is done during the right time period. So if you're doing conventional testing kind of in that 1 to 3 month mark, if it's past that, then we want to do kind of more comprehensive testing both sides of the immune system. And if it's early, then potentially testing the tick itself, meaning if you pull the tick off and send it into the lab, you might have your answer back before those couple of weeks are up. The other thing too is that if you're just unsure, I would go to the doctor and ask for prophylaxis antibiotics for the Lyme, just to make sure that you don't get it, because sometimes the testing can take so long to come back that you already have full-blown Lyme. But I mean, that's obviously a discussion to have with your functional medicine doctor or your ILADS doctor or Lyme literate doctor. And if you don't have that choice, at least just your family doctor or nurse practitioner. And I think the more information you can come in with and present it in a very clean and logical way, then they'll be more likely to accommodate requests. So if you want to learn more about Lyme disease, testing, treatment, co-infections, all of the complicating things, please click to subscribe. Please click like, comments. I appreciate all of these things. And if you have any questions or topics you want me to address in the future, I'd be more than happy. Just leave a comment in the section below.